So next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hugh Harvey. We're delighted to have him today. Dr. Harvey received his Bachelor of Science in Medical Imaging and Informatics, as well as his Doctor of Medicine from the Imperial College of London. He's an experienced clinician and a health technology advisor, and he focuses on leveraging big data and artificial intelligence. He's a board-certified consultant radiologist, and he's also academically trained at the UK National Health Service and at Europe's leading cancer research center, the Institute of Cancer Research in London, where he was twice awarded the ICR Science Writer of the Year. Dr. Harvey has had lead roles in 2 flagship UK startups that led to successfully gaining the world's first CE marking for AI-supported triage service and the first UK CE marking for deep learning medical device. And the CE marking really is an affirmation that a manufacturer conforms with the European health, safety, and environmental protection standards for products that are sold within Europe. Dr. Harvey has also acted as a co-chair to the Topol Health Technology Review that the Health Education England, commissioned by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, asked them to put forward. He now serves as a managing director at Hardian Health. He's consulting for many AI startup companies across the globe, and he retains academic interest as a board member of the global open source scientific journal, Nature Digital Medicine. Dr. Harvey's a fellow of the Royal College of Radiologists, and he holds an honorary research fellowship at the Institute of Cognitive Neurosciences at the University of College London. He tweets, his blogs and publications have educated many of us worldwide on machine learning and AI and regulatory affairs in digital health. I don't see the piano behind him today, but he does play the piano. But today he's going to talk to us about global regulation of AI, what you need to know. So Dr. Harvey, we're thrilled to have you. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and you can go ahead and share yours.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much. That's a very embarrassing and pretentious list of things, but I suppose they're all true. And hello to everyone around the world. And yes, I'm not in my office today. It's just too hot here. You wouldn't believe it. We're having a bit of a heat wave in the UK. So I'm going to talk for something that I'm really passionate about and have been involved with for over half a decade now, which is the regulation of AI as a medical device. And I first fell into this this kind of sector, or this part of the whole AI landscape, completely by accident. I was at a startup at the time called Babylon Health, and I started to realize that the app we were building probably met the definitions of what a medical device was. And so we arranged meetings with the national regulators here in the UK, the MHRA, and they didn't know. No one had built an AI kind of chatbot for medical purposes before, and they didn't really know how to regulate it. So we worked very hard with them to get the first ever CE mark on that. And then I moved to a startup called Chiron Medical, which is in the radiology sector, looking at breast cancer screening. And again, got the first CE mark for a deep learning based solution for breast cancer screening, and that was a class 2 device. I'll be talking a little bit more about the generalities of CE marking, but also not just the European market, obviously, but the US, and then the broader global picture. So let's go to the slides. Here we go. So this is the basic thing is, whatever you're building for AI in medicine, if you are intending it to be used by a patient or a doctor or a hospital or a general practitioner or any healthcare professional, you are very, very likely going to be building a medical device, and therefore you will need some kind of regulatory approval. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today, are the main systems. So the main system in Europe is called the CE mark, which stands for Conformité Européenne. And then you have in America, the FDA, and you're all well aware of them and what they do, especially during COVID. They've been approving vaccines and things like that. So I'm going to talk a bit about the differences between the two systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK system, because now that we are post-Brexit, for better or worse, gray zone at the moment. And then I'm going to talk about what do other countries do. And I'm going to sort of try and keep it focused slightly on radiology AI, because that's my knowledge area, but try and give tips as well for things outside of that sector. So the first thing to do when you realize that you're building AI for it's going to be a medical device, is to think about the risk class of what that device is going to be. And not all devices are in the same risk class, obviously. Now, before AI came along, there were risk classes for software as a medical device, or SAMD. This is sometimes also called medical device software, though that tends to be software that's in a hardware medical device. SAMD more typically relates to standalone software as a medical device. So it's the things that we're building, an AI algorithm that analyzes some medical data and gives an output to a clinician or a patient. But typically with software as a medical device, they were stratified into 3 risk classes. And this is according to the IMDRF risk classification, the International Medical Device Risk Forum. So they class them into low risk, and high risk, 1 to 3. Now, a low risk is really something that is just generally kind of storing information or archiving information. So it could be something like a PACS system, or just an information system of some kind. Something, if you have a piece of software where you can record someone's blood pressure over time, that might be a low risk piece of software, because it's not really doing anything to that data. It's not, really making any decisions or changing management. It's just a mechanism for storing data. So that's quite low risk. Then I'll go to the high risk ones. So the high risk are things that are generally in very time critical or life threatening situations where the software is a very important part of the process. So a good example can be, CT scanner software. Very important, very high risk. If it goes wrong, you could have potentially, irradiate a patient far too much, or if the scan quality is not good, you can obviously miss things, and that comes at great cost and potentially, delayed treatment and diagnosis. Everything else kind of fits into class 2. And I'm going to talk mainly about class 2 devices in my talk today, because that's where most AI sits. How do you figure out what risk class you are? Well, you need something called an intended use statement, and you'll need this whether you're applying in America or Europe. And here's how the FDA define the intended use. It's generally you should consider an intended use really as, what do you want your product to do on the packaging and labeling that comes with it? So how do you describe your device? And something really important to know about intended use is that words matter. The words you use to describe your device, the claims you want to make, really matter. And if there's any piece of your regulatory documentation that the regulators will spend a lot of time on, it is the intended use statement. And it's really a very useful tool. And when I'm consulting with companies and startups and people trying to build AI, I spend a lot of time on the intended use, because often you get startups saying, well, we've got a bunch of data and we're just going to figure out what we can do with it. And I go, well, the regulators aren't going to approve something that you've just built out of a bunch of data and then found some connection or causality. You need to kind of go the other way around and say, this is the clinical problem we're trying to solve, and this is the software that's going to help solve that problem by doing X, Y, or Z. And the intended use is very important to get right. It also needs to match all of your labeling claims, your advertising materials, what your salespeople tell to potential clients. And really, it's kind of like the linchpin or the North Star of the piece of software that you're building. It's also a very useful tool in terms of software development lifecycle. If you can have all your developers aligned to a specific intended use, you can break that intended use down into software requirements, which leads into your design processes. So it's really, really important to get right. And I'm going to give some examples after this next slide. So the intended use is broken down in, well, it has a subcategory known as indications for use. So the intended use is your general purpose. You also have to indicate, when it should not be used or possible misuse. So an example for that might be, maybe let's say you have a chest X-ray AI detection algorithm that can find pneumonia. Possible misuse is that people are expecting it to find lung nodules or rib fractures, which you're not expecting it to find. So, you know, you have to be very clear that it's just to find the pneumonia. The indications for use will be saying exactly what disease or condition it is, whether it's diagnosing, treating, preventing, or curing. Most of the time with AI, it's just diagnosing. And you have to describe in quite substantial detail your target patient population demographics. So exactly what age groups, sex, ethnicities, if applicable. You need to define exactly the qualifications or the level of training required for the end user, whether that's a patient or a clinician. And you have to define exactly the environment that you're planning to use it. And often that's done with diagrams and things like that. So I'm going to give some examples on intended uses. So these are intended uses that I've got just off the FDA website, because you can search for these for various products. And I've removed some facts so that there's things missing. So we might think that this looks like a very complete intended use. So I've removed the product names, obviously. So just to go through it, and I am going to read this one out, highlighting or emphasizing the important parts. So this product is a radiological computer-aided triage and notification software indicated for use in the analysis of abdominal CT images. So you have to find what it's really intending to do in terms of diagnose, treat, or cure. It's saying it's triage notification. And they've said it's going to be on abdominal CT images. They haven't said really whether it's got non-contrast or contrast CT at this stage. The device is intended to assist hospitals and trained radiologists in workflow triage by flagging and communicating suspected findings of IFG, intra-abdominal free gas. So here we have the indication for use. It's only looking for one pathology on a CT scan. The second paragraph, it uses an AI algorithm to analyze and highlight cases and detected findings on a standalone desktop application. So that means it's not necessarily integrated with PACS in parallel to the ongoing standard of care. The user presented with notifications for cases with suspected findings. Notifications include compressed preview images that are meant for informational purposes only and not intended for diagnostic use beyond notification. So they're making very clear that they don't really want this intended to be a diagnostic piece of software. The device does not alter the original medical image and is not intended to be used as a diagnostic device. They're saying this because they don't want to go up into a higher risk class categorization. The results of this product are intended to be used in conjunction with other patient information and based on professional judgment to assist with triage prioritization of medical images. Notified clinicians are responsible for viewing full images by the standard of care. So they're going on to a little bit of misuse potential there. But this is not a complete intended use statement. So I'm just going to go through what we think might be missing. So they've said the qualifications of the end user is a radiologist. They've identified the modality, but as I said, they didn't really say if it was contrast or non-contrast. They've identified the specific pathology. They've identified how the device produces an output. They've clarified some possible misuse. So we're looking good, but they haven't defined the patient population. They haven't said if this is pediatric. They haven't said if it's adult, male, female, or anything like that, or ethnicity, if that's applicable. I very much doubt intra-abdominal free gas would look different on people of different ethnicities, but maybe there's data to suggest that. I've no idea. So you can see here that this kind of intended use would be rejected by the FDA, and they'd say, well, no, the patient population has not been defined. Please go back and tell us. And of course, you can only claim in your intended use a population that you've actually tested and validated on. So if you've only tested it on a data set of 70-year-olds, you will only be able to sell a product that can detect intra-abdominal free gas in 70-year-olds. Going to do another one, but I'm not going to read the whole thing out. This one's on an adult chest X-ray system. And again, they defined it as an AI system. They defined, the environment it's meant to be in. They defined what it does and some of the contraindications and misuse, but there's a couple of bits missing. So let's have a look. So they defined this as for pleural effusion. They defined this time that it is for adults. They defined the modality of chest X-ray. Again, they haven't said if it's frontal, lateral, PA, whatever. They defined the outputs. They defined the clinical environment. They clarified the misuse, but what is missing? The qualifications of the end user. they've said it's just designed to aid the clinical assessment of chest x-rays. The clinical assessment by whom? A radiologist, a junior doctor, a patient? They haven't said. So this is very important to include. So again, this could easily be rejected by the FDA. Again, these are real statements where I've removed these bits of information to make a point. Okay, so now we've talked about intended use and risk class. We are going to have a quick look at the regulatory infrastructures and sort of show at a high level how they might differ between different jurisdictions. So in the European Union, we have the CE mark. Since 26th of May, just a few weeks ago, we have transitioned to what's known as the Medical Devices Regulation, the EU MDR. That provides governance for most of Europe. And then national regulatory bodies, each country will have their own. The UK has the MHRA, but Italy, France, Germany will have their own. They take on the European Medical Device Regulations as the kind of the laws that are required. They enforce those laws. Then you have several notified bodies. These are external groups and consultancies, so are all trained and certified in the medical device regulations to conduct audits independently. They come in and have a look at your product and ask you lots of very annoying and random questions about it. And the notified bodies deal with all the vendors. So if a vendor wants to get a CE mark, they apply to a notified body. The notified body does the audit. The notified body says, yes, we think you've passed all the checks, you can have the CE mark. They give the certificate to the vendors. They also notify the local national body. And then what's going to happen in 3 years' time is it's going to go back to the European Commission, and they're going to have a database called EUDAMED, which is going to log all of the CE mark devices. Currently, you cannot search online for what devices have got a CE mark. There is no central database for this. There is one being built called EUDAMED. There is a database for the FDA, and there's also an adverse events database called MAUDE, M-A-U-D-E, for American devices, but there's no such thing for European ones. So what are the main differences, and why is transitioning to the medical device regulation important? Well, I think the main thing is that it's actually now a mandatory law that is applicable to everyone in Europe. Before, it was just kind of legislation. It was up to each country to decide whether it went into law, but this is now the law. It's much, much bigger. It's like 6 times longer, and it actually, for the first time, mentions software as a medical device much more specifically. The previous ones were written, over a decade ago, so software in medicine wasn't as huge an issue, and AI certainly wasn't on the landscape. At least the deep learning paradigm of AI wasn't on the landscape when the MDD were written. The MDR does not specify anything specific about artificial intelligence yet. It still only talks about software as a medical device. So I'm not going to bore all of the international people too much on the main differences, other than to let you know a couple of high-level fundamental changes that you need to be aware of, the differences between MDD and MDR. The first is that they've really kind of narrowed down the definition of a medical device. There are a lot of people who were trying to get into gray zones where there were borderline cases, or they could try and skip regulation. So they've tried to really make it less possible for people to get into that gray zone, or try and avoid regulatory scrutiny. They've clarified risk classification, especially for software, and I've got another slide on that. The biggest change, and this is the one that's going to affect most AI developers, is post-market surveillance and what's known as PSUR, which is periodic safety update reports. There's a huge section, it's about a third of the regulation, on ongoing monitoring and safety and clinical performance of the device when it's on market. And this is in recognition of the fact that we have loads and loads of software coming out, and people buy it, and then the software developer kind of just forgets it. It's off the shelf software, and there's no kind of monitoring or ongoing checks that the performance is staying stable. People talk about concepts now of algorithmic drift, and this is really where post-market surveillance comes in. So manufacturers are mandated to form what's known as a post-market clinical follow-up plan. You must, before you get regulatory approval, have a plan, likely in the format of a prospective clinical trial, to check your post-deployment performance. And this must be on data different to the one that you did pre-market. The two final things are mandatory now to give each version of your software a unique device identifier, which is called a UDI. This is in line with what the FDA does. And again, as I mentioned before, the UDIMED database will be built. They tried to build it for this year, but they never got around to it because of COVID. So it will be built in 3 years' time, is my understanding. So how did the definition of a medical device change in Europe? Well, there's a small extension, as I said, targeting standalone software, which is now classified in its own right. It wasn't before. And they've included the specific medical purposes of prediction and prognosis. So prediction was kind of this tricky word, which wasn't quite diagnosis or treatment or notification. It's kind of like we estimate or we predict a risk or have a prognosis for. And there wasn't really anything covering that under MBD. So now if you're building an app which is meant to predict your kidney function or your risk of stroke, this is now definitely a medical device. And this kind of rather cleverly, the way that they've done this actually might capture some other additional medical software, which previously was just billed as sort of, very low risk archive storage software, which might have shown trends over time. Those trends now count as predictions, so they might immediately become medical devices as well. And this is the rule that's changed on its own. It's called Rule 11, and it specifically now says it's software to provide information with decisions, diagnosis, or therapeutic purpose. Unless, of course, those decisions have an impact that may cause death, irreversible deterioration of a person's state of health, or serious deterioration or surgical intervention, in which case it's class 2B. So what this does for AI systems is it actually upgrades a lot of the basic ones up to at least a class 2B. So my old company where I was, we got a class 2A under MDD, but we were breast cancer screening. And clearly, if you miss a cancer, that can cause death or irreversible state of health. Or if you overcall a cancer, it could lead to a surgical intervention. So it will have to be upclassed to a 2B. You didn't have to do it by the deadline. There's a transition period to 2024. But this, if you wanted to bring a new breast cancer algorithm to market, you would now have to do a class 2B assessment. There were some specific changes which would affect radiology products. So PACS systems, which only sort of is a storage archive system, is still not a medical device as it wasn't before. But if it does any of these things, such as informing further treatments, so measuring things for radiation therapy, allowing you to manipulate pictures or do time series comparisons or monitor progression, they now count as a medical device. So a lot of PACS vendors are not happy about this because they wanted to sneak in bits of AI here and there to do these things. They now have to get each and every one of those algorithms CE marked. So here's an example. I think I just mentioned it before. Yes, if your screening mammogram is now upgraded to class 2B. What about stroke? This is now actually upgraded to class 3. And that's because it may cause or prevent death. And then it's very likely to be upgraded to a class 3 device. Now, clearly in these images, no human doctor worth their salt would think these are normal. But I have seen weird and wonderful outputs for AI systems. And so an AI system could theoretically get these wrong if there was some confounding factor or corrupt data in the input image. And so therefore, let's say a neuroradiology interventionist was relying on a system at 3 o'clock in the morning to flag them if there's potential stroke, and it didn't see this or it got it wrong, then this patient would lie in that bed for a few more hours. And obviously this is life critical. So that's why it's a class 3 device. By the way, I just want to add, the regulations specify that the highest possible risk, however unlikely, is the one that classifies your device. So if there's any chance that your device could cause a death, you will be higher risk class, unfortunately. So what about the UK? This is a cartoon map of Europe. The purple ones are the member states. The green ones are other states, which are kind of in Europe, but I don't really understand the difference. And then some of them are not in Europe because they're sort of still half annexed by Russia. But what about the UK? We are doing our own thing, apparently. but we've left the European Union. So when the transition happened to MDR, it didn't apply to us. So we're still stuck with MDD. So if you want to come and get regulated in the UK, it is slightly less stringent than it is on the European continent, at least for now, until our local regulatory body decides to make up its own rules. Those rules are still being discussed and decided. I have visibility on some of those conversations, but there's a large political shift to form some kind of difference from Europe, just to prove that we can in some respects, but we'll find out more. So the UK regulatory infrastructure now looks like this. We don't have a CE mark, we have a UK CA mark, which actually we had before we joined the European Union back in, I think it was the late 70s. But now we're converted back to UKCA. The MHRA remain the national governing body for regulatory devices. We only have 3 approved bodies. They're not called notified bodies, they're called approved bodies now, and they're the ones that deal with all the vendors. So good news and bad news for vendors is, well, if you want to come to Europe, you now need to get a CE mark for mainland Europe and a UK CE mark for the UK. We do accept the CE mark, but we will stop accepting it after, I think, 2024. So you've got a few years to get in. After that, there's going to be a different paradigm, and I don't know what that will look like. You also need what's known as a UKRP, a UK responsible person. It's now the law, and lots of people don't realize this, since January the 1st, which was Brexit Day. If you have a medical device and your office for your company is based outside the UK, you need someone in the UK qualified to do so to register it with our local body. And that's a small advert from me. There are some deadlines to do this by, depending on what class of device you have. Most AI will fit into the 3rd one, which is the 1st of September. So you have till the 1st of September to find a UK responsible person to do this for you. So I'll give you my email at the end of this talk. Okay, that's Europe and England in a nutshell. Let me just check the time. Okay, we're good on time, about halfway through. Now, this is the American regulatory infrastructure, vastly more simple. You just have one bureaucratic body called the FDA, who all the vendors deal with. There's no middlemen of notified bodies and things like that. Well, in fact, there are, because the FDA do subcontract some of their work. The definition of is very, very broadly similar to that of the MDR. Again, it's a machine or software that's intended for use in the diagnosis of a disease or other conditions. In man or animals. Now, there are several pathways that you can take a device to regulatory clearance. You don't just have the one pathway that we have over here in Europe. You have 4, well, 3 really, because no application is only if you're exempt. So you have 3, and I have no idea why it's called a 510K, but it's called a 510K. Basically, if you produce a product which is essentially the same as what someone else already has on market, that's called a predicate device. If you can basically prove that your device does the same thing to the same safety standards, to something that's already approved by or cleared by the FDA, then you can go down the 510K route. And this is the simplest, fastest, cheapest way to get a clearance, probably 6 to 9 months all in, if you do the work. Now, the very first devices that came through, some of them with using deep learning actually used old CAD style radiology devices as a predicate, which some people raised eyebrows at, because the new software obviously works in a completely different function. But the FDA seemed happy that people had proved that it actually, produced the same outputs, or at least did better in terms of clinical performance. Now, if you have a new device, so you invent something that no one else has ever put on market before, there's 2 pathways depending on your risk. So if you're low to moderate, so probably a class 1 or 2, you go down the de novo route. The de novo route is longer for the reason that the FDA have to invent a new special classification for your device, and sometimes they have to create new regulations specifically for that class of device, and identify what are known as special controls, so special reporting measures and things like that that the manufacturer will have to submit. And this allows a 510K pathway to be opened up for everyone else who wants to follow you. So really, the American system is kind of, if you're first, you have to put in all the work. If you're second, you can do half the work. And we see this all the time with deep learning. One person gets the chest X-ray classification and then everyone else quickly follows suit down a 510K. And it seems rather unfair, but that's how new ground is broken. The same happens with PMAs, which is a pre-market approval, and this is for high-risk, very novel devices. This is only for class 3, and they do a lot of scientific and clinical review. Generally, with AI systems, which are diagnosing or triaging or predicting, people don't go for a PMA. So I've not done that process myself. So those are the main pathways. The FDA currently, like the MDR, do not have any specific enforceable guidance relating just to AI as software. They are obviously interested in this space, and they've been doing public consultation on this, and they've proposed, they've got a nice white paper you can download off their website, what they called good machine learning practice. So they're proposing a sort of software development lifecycle framework, which kind of goes through the whole product lifecycle, pre-market and post-market, which is based on what a consortium of experts will agree are accepted practice in machine learning development and testing. And so that's what they're kind of building in at the moment. And this is a diagram that many of you will probably have seen if you've been interested in this space. So they'll be looking at everything from the data selection and management all the way through to how you actually monitor the model and then feed back that loop to retrain the algorithm. I want to pause here for a little bit because there is a small myth in AI circles and regulatory circles that at the moment you cannot get regulatory approval for a device that learns on its own while in clinical deployment. So people talk about fixed algorithms and algorithms that continuously learn. So the myth is that there's no regulation that covers continuously learning algorithms. So while it's true that all of the regulations fit very nicely around fixed algorithms because you've built it, designed, tested, and you ship that single product, the myth is actually that continuously learning algorithms actually exist, not that there isn't regulation for them. What people get confused about is that AI systems do not learn on their own. They require data scientists to keep putting in the data and doing the hyperparameter tweaking and things like that. There are no examples, to my knowledge, in medicine of algorithms which are left to learn on their own. There's always a human involved in the loop. And so really the FDA have they've acknowledged that there's this kind of expectation that people will be able to retrain and improve performance of their algorithms. They're not explicitly calling out the myth that the algorithms learn themselves. I think what they're doing is sort of allowing some space for future possibilities where algorithms could learn on their own by putting in this kind of model. So that's all I wanted to say on that myth. So the truth is you can change your algorithm after it's been approved by the FDA. It doesn't have to be fixed. However, if you change it too much, then you may trigger a new intended use, and hence you might need to do a new application. So obviously, if your algorithm is going to identify or measure a new thing, then you change your intended use. So if you move from detecting rib fractures to wrist fractures, well, obviously it's a completely different device. If you change your target population significantly, it's not, if you extend your population from I can diagnose 35 to 50-year-olds to I can diagnose 30-year-olds to 60-year-olds, that should be okay under their new proposed pathways. But if you're going from adults to children, that you may need a new intended use. And obviously if you're changing anatomical location. The other important one is if you're trying to move your device from one environment to another, i.e. from a screening setting to a diagnostic setting. And then the last one, and this is probably the most interesting one, is if your change in your intended use over time leads to identification of or implication of a new effect on the clinical outcome, then that might change your risk classification and it might change your need to reapply. So that's quite an interesting one because that kind of relies on what we call as the health economic benefits. And the example I've given here is if screening mammography reduces breast cancer mortality, as an AI developer, if that's your purpose to reduce breast cancer mortality when before you were just triaging, you might actually need to reapply just to make that claim. So that's quite an interesting little side hook there. So how do you change your algorithm? Well, you agree with the FDA, what's called a predetermined change control plan, or PCCP. So yeah, you can change your algorithm, and in this you'll pre-specify what are called SPS, pre-specifications. And this, you might say, look, I'm going to come on market covering a certain age group, but I plan to increase that age group. And the FDA will say, that's fine. Or you say, I plan to increase sensitivity, specificity, and make performance improvements over time. Again, that's fine. But you have to have plans written down for this. You can't just tell them you're going to do it. You have to show them how you're going to do it. Or you might, figure out there's better ways or new ways or different data that you want to, include in the inputs of your device. And again, that's fine if we plan it out first. And then you have to define, well, how are we actually going to change the algorithm? And now you need an ACP, an algorithmic change protocol. And this is verification validation steps, just like you would do the first time you made it. You have to repeat all those processes and document them and have a quality management system in place to document how you're going to do this. And this changes to data management or retraining or performance or updates to your procedures. So it is a complete myth that only fixed algorithms can get approved. It's also a complete myth that AI devices can learn on their own. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and then the FDA is probably leading globally on thinking about how to let algorithmic developers consistently improve their algorithms post-market. So what about the rest of the world? Well, most of the world will accept the CE mark or an FDA clearance or thereabouts. It comes into really whether, and I don't know if these are the politically correct terms, I apologize if they're not. If Brazil, Canada, Japan and things, you may have your own local regulatory bodies. Most countries largely copy kind of the FDA's processes. If you're sort of developing world, you may just accept a CE mark or FDA clearance from another country because you don't have a local medical device, governmental body. But what some of the countries are doing around the world, and they've been doing this since 2012, I believe, is talking about a medical device single audit program called MDSAP. Wouldn't it be wonderful if instead of having to do FDA in America and CE mark in Europe and UKCA in UK and the Japanese one in Japan and the Canadian one in Canada, as a manufacturer based anywhere in the world, you could do one regulatory approval? Wouldn't that be fantastic? I think so. And these countries think so too. So at the moment, you can, if you get regulatory clearance in one of these countries, you can do a short extra audit called an MDSAP audit, and then you can sell into all of these countries. You will obviously have to have all of your post-market clinical follow-up and your algorithmic change plan and all this kind of stuff. But it's a much, much faster route. And I've helped a couple of companies get this now, and it massively broadens their market footprint almost immediately. Canada, Australia, Brazil, Japan, outside of America is a huge global jurisdiction. So I think we're going to see a lot more about MDSAP coming up shortly. I would love the UK government to join this as well. We did take part in some of the pilots, but I've not heard much since that for a couple of years. So watch out for MDSAP. And if you are an international company or an American-based company, and you're figuring out how to get around the world, obviously not in Europe, you still need CE mark, then look at the MDSAP. So what are all of these global regulations based on? Well, there is something called the International Standards Organization and also the International Electrotechnical Commission. And they have lots of bodies of experts who produce technical standards for all sorts of weird and wonderful things. There are tens of thousands of these standards, and they are all given completely random 5-digit numbers to document them. So if you are at all wanting to impress anybody with your regulatory knowledge, these are the 4 or 5-digit numbers that you need to remember off the top of your head. And anyone who works in AI software development in a company will hopefully know these numbers by now if they've gone through CE marking or FDA clearance. So the number one thing to know is ISO 13485, which relates to quality management systems. If you want a class 2 in Europe or class 2 or 3 in Europe or America, you will need to be audited separately for a quality management system. And you will see many companies advertising the fact that we are now ISO 13485 certified. What does that mean? It means you now have in place the software development lifecycle processes and the documentation processes to build software to the standard that's required of building medical devices. It does not clear you for individual products. It means that your company is certified to build the software in a way that people think is acceptable standard practice. I've seen some universities and even indeed some hospitals have been successful in getting this. And so if you're an academic or a hospital and you're thinking, well, we've got loads of research algorithms, but we're not allowed to use them. Well, why don't you go and get ISO 13485 certified? And then you're building medical grade software. Obviously, cybersecurity is a huge issue with AI. So you will also likely need to get audited for 27001 security management standard. If you're building software, you will need to adhere to IEC 62304, which is the software lifecycle development process. And this is what the FDA are basing their proposals on good machine learning practice. They're taking into account lots of the detail of 62304. And then risk management as well, 14971. You will need to develop a benefit risk ratio and do hazard scoring and all sorts of things. So having all those processes done to recognize risk management standards is again going to be required of you. You can be audited for all of these standards. Most companies just get the first two. They're not mandatory, the last two, but 13485 is mandatory for most of the world to get. So I think I'm coming to the end. I think we're almost there. I've only got a couple of slides left. I just want to talk about the future of regulation, or what I would like to see happen. A really interesting paper came out just over a year ago in the journal which I helped work at, Nature Digital Medicine. I was really, really happy when this one came out. Just like when you open a packet of pills, there'll be a white paper fold out thing in there with a whole bunch of information about that pill. It will tell you what it is, what it does, what the side effects are, what the contraindications for use are, you know, what not to do, what to do if you take too much, etc. And I think we should do exactly the same for algorithms that we're selling into hospitals or giving to patients. There should be a similar kind of data sheet, fact sheet, or facts label, or whatever you want to call it, to give the high level information. And this paper sort of presented this really nicely and succinctly. It gives, you know, exactly the mechanism. It says what the intended use is, it gives the risks, etc., and then it links to other information. I think this is vitally important because I keep saying algorithms are the new drugs, and I still believe that. And I think, you know, if you can be producing these kind of cards on your website, your company websites, or within your apps, I think this just helps everyone understand better the limitations and risks of your device, and proves that you've got, you know, safety and clinical performance at the top of mind. So I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing global regulators say, well, your labeling needs to conform to some kind of set algorithmic modeled facts card. I'm hoping that will be the case. I don't know which country will implement that first, however. And that is the end of my talk. If you want to contact me, that's my email, or I'm always on Twitter at Dr. Hugh Harvey. But it's been a pleasure, and I hope I haven't rambled on for too long, and I'm very happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Harvey. That was fantastic, taking a really complex area and boiling it down for us to understand that. There are questions, and we're going to get to them. I just had one question or clarification when you mentioned that for the CE and now for the MDR, that they really look at you know, description of for which patients is this model intended for, what is the use of this software. And I wanted to know, how detailed does the regulatory body get in terms of what was the data cohort that the model was trained upon? Because we're seeing in the States, you know, the poor generalization of algorithms to other patient populations. I was just wondering if, in fact, they get deep into that.
They absolutely do. A good example is apps that can detect skin cancer by taking a photo. You have to be very, very cautious over the skin types that you use. And in fact, if you read between the lines and the intended uses of all the apps that have got all the skin cancer detection software that's been FDA cleared, they all exclude the extremes of the Fitzpatrick scale. So very, very white pale skin or very, very dark black skin. And this is because the FDA has gone back and said, well, you haven't proven you've got, you know, the right accuracy levels or the benchmark diagnostic levels in those skin types. And what disappoints me sometimes is that you see companies get these kind of clearances and then really hide that in any of their marketing. They try and claim that it works for everybody. And I think what the regulators want to do is they're not kind of like at the fun police. They don't want to take everyone off market. They want innovation to happen. They want people to come on market, but they want them to be, to be honest about the limitations of what they've got. So the FDA in particular will mandate you need to prove it works on American data. You need to have a certain subset of Hispanic and Afro American patients in the data if your intended use is to be generalizable. And they can get very detailed, especially my experience with breast cancer. They can get very detailed into substratifications of age, of even things like have they had surgery before, what's the breast density was, and so they can drill down into substratifications. And what they can often end up doing is suggesting to the manufacturers to remove claims of performance on certain substratifications of patient demographics. In an ideal world, we would all have access to unlimited data, but we don't. So we can only build algorithms on the data that we can get. What's reassuring about the FDA's proposal for people to be allowed to update their algorithms is that as manufacturers get or acquire more data, they can update their algorithm over time. So you can actually go through with quite a limited clearance and hopefully over time update that, as long as you don't trigger a new intended use, because then you have to reapply.
That's reassuring that the FDA is doing that. Well, you're getting lots of kudos, terrific talk, very informative, so on and so forth, excellent talk. But let's get to some questions here from Dr. Felipe Kitamura. Great presentation, Dr. Harvey. You mentioned the stroke algorithm as a class 3. Is that the case even if the model is used to triage or to avoid the radiologist missing the finding? And his main point, he says here, is the radiologist is still reading and reporting the exam. It's not for primary interpretation here, but does that make any difference? Or even if the model is not autonomous, should it still be a class 3?
Yeah, so the example I gave is it's class 3 if the clinician is relying on the algorithm to make the time critical notification. If the algorithm is actually sort of ancillary or augmentative to the care pathway, and that image is going to be read by a human within standard of care timeframes, then no, it's not class 3. But if everyone is relying 100% on the algorithm to say, there's a stroke here, then clearly it's very, very dangerous if it goes wrong. So that's the nuance in it. Sorry, my doorbell went, I'm going to have to ignore it. That's the nuance. And yeah, don't worry, not all stroke algorithms are class 3. It depends what your intended use is for the stroke algorithm.
Okay, and Felipe said that answered his question, so thank you very much. Another question here. Does change of hospital data for training and validation with considerable domain expansion in terms of distribution, race, gender, et cetera, also going to change the intended use of the AI model? Now that's an interesting, it may or may not, right?
Again, it will depend, and you will have to discuss with the FDA in your pre-specifications. It's totally acceptable to change gender as long as it's a disease that affects both men and women. Clearly, with breast cancer, it might be not possible, but with many of these things, it really will rely on those discussions that you have with the FDA. Does change of hospital data make it into change intended use? No, that's fine. You're allowed to gain new data and acquire it. You just have to show that you have. There must be someone at my front door. To show that you have, the software processes in place to acquire and ingest that new data, and you can pre-specify that in advance and have an algorithmic change protocol. So it will depend on what the exact parameters are, but you can discuss all of these with the FDA.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Dr. Kitamura. Have you heard anything if Brazil, the ANVISA, ANVISA, are they joining the MD-SAP effort? And would you know who to contact to get involved in nudging them to do this?
I don't have direct knowledge of this. All I'm aware of that is Brazil has taken part in the MDSAP pilot, and to the best of my knowledge, they do accept devices that have passed an MDSAP audit. I've not done a regulatory clearance in Brazil, so I would be reluctant to give a solid, definite answer. I'm assuming ANVISA is the national regulatory body for medical devices in Brazil? And if so, they should have some details about MDSAP on their website, I would imagine. Sorry, I can't give a more full answer on that.
No, that's great. I mean, it would be wonderful if everyone can get on board with that. That would be fantastic. Another question here, again, great talk, kudos here. Can you comment on machine learning models that are used to improve overall image quality? Do they follow the same regulatory path as a predictive diagnostic algorithm? And I'll add to that my own question. You know, what if it is sort of back office activities, scheduling, and you know, missed appointment kinds of things? Do these follow the same regulatory process?
So I'll answer your second part first. If it's operational, so missed appointments and things, no, it doesn't class as a medical device because you're not diagnosing, treating, curing, or mitigating a disease. So no, those don't class as a medical device. If you're talking about improving image quality, that is a medical device, and especially under the MDR, as I talked about with the PACS things, if you are manipulating images to change how they are appearing to a radiologist, then yes, they will now be a medical device.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And then just one question. You know, we've heard a lot about explainable AI, and you could argue this one way or the other, that it'll never be explainable, or that it is explainable. It's doing things that the human eye does as we interrogate visual scenes and so on. And I know that Europe has been very strict about this and in requiring not just in healthcare, but artificial intelligence applications to explain how they work in some way. Is this tied in at all to any of the regulatory bodies? And what are your thoughts around this whole notion of people's concerns with explainable AI?
It's a tricky area because different people mean different things when they say explainable AI. The truth is, it's very difficult to truly understand why a deep learning system has come up to the conclusion it has. It's very hard to know in any specific condition. I mean, we can do things like saliency maps or probability estimates, but none of these things really give a guaranteed cast iron truth. And this is the difference between deep learning software and previous, just programmable software, where you could do a root cause analysis. You could go back and say, well, I found a bug, or I know exactly the chain of programming that led to this decision. With deep learning, you can't do that. And the regulators, there is no regulation that really addresses that problem. The closest thing is what's known as human usability. So you can or should be doing human usability studies to make sure that humans understand that the AI has limitations, what those limitations are, and then how to act or report upon things that go wrong. Really, that's the kind of the best we have at the moment. I'm kind of in two minds about mandating regulations for explainable AI because I just don't think it's possible. Is my bottom line answer on it. I've yet to see anyone convincingly explain exactly why a deep learning system did what it did.
Great, thank you. And we still have time for a few more questions here. Again, lots of kudos, Dr. Harvey. Thanks for excellent talk. Taking the analogy to drug development, do you see a future need for a centralized reporting system for errors similar to the UK yellow card scheme? And this is from Dr. Gideon Lemma.
Yes, and America has the MORDS database. We have the yellow card scheme here in the UK, which is if there's a drug interaction that you suspect as a clinician, you can fill in what's called a yellow card and send it off to the regulators for drugs. Yes, absolutely. And I would love to see a UK database, or indeed a EU one or a global one. I think there is space in the market for it. The problem is that how do you find the funding to do it on a global scale? It would take a lot of countries coming together to decide this is a good idea. But the UDMED database that's going to come into force will obviously allow people to report errors as well. One thing to say is that all manufacturers have a legal obligation to provide contact details to all their clients so that people can contact them to explain or describe errors as well. So there is that. But yeah, flagging them to regulators is less clear over here in Europe in regards to AI as it is in America, who have the MORDS database.
Well, I think I'm sorry to keep you during your dinner time in UK, but a couple more questions here. Regarding the models to increase image quality, is there a consensus on the class to which this would fit?
It depends what images and what quality claims you're making. and the severity of the conditions that you could possibly expect to be in trying to improve the image quality on. Most of them will probably be class 2, I would imagine. I guess the question Felipe is thinking about, things that low dose CT or sparse acquisition MRI are class 2, and there's a couple of products on the market that have got that already.
Great, fantastic. And then just 2 more questions here, and then we'll let you go. The MD SAP seems like a great idea, but what about meaningfully different requirements for model output and performance across different patient populations? For example, in Brazil versus Japan, they may have very different breast densities. So,
yeah, so an MD SAP audit, the extension of your CE marking FDA clearance, should in theory look at that and say, look, we appreciate you want to get more global footprints, so therefore the MD SAP audit will require you to produce the same level of clinical evidence on the populations to which you are planning to deploy. But that requires them. Sometimes it's chicken and egg. I want to expand to Brazil. That means before that I actually need to get data from Brazil, and how do I get data from Brazil if I haven't expanded there yet? So it all gets quite tricky for manufacturers to do so.
Difficult problem. And this sounds like an interesting question to end on here from an anonymous attendee. Do you think the AI bubble is going to burst soon, with more and more AI models being shown to break when they're tested on external data sets? And what are the regulator thoughts about this?
I think what I like to say at this point is that regulatory approval doesn't mean that the AI system is perfect, because we all know it's not. No one's reported an accuracy of 100%. It doesn't mean that it actually is useful. All it means is it's been built to the right standards, that the evidence pre-market was enough to satisfy that it should meet the standard of care. The post-market part of regulation says, well, you need to keep monitoring for that. And if that doesn't happen and you don't meet your post-market targets and goals as specified in your post-market plans, you could be taken off market, or you should take yourself off market. So the regulations are kind of like, in a way, the minimum bar to market entry. And the proof really is in the pudding. And yes, I'm aware there's lots of issues with models. I wouldn't say breaking, but not working to the same level of performance on more diverse data sets. And the problem is, unfortunately, at the moment, more training data required. And often when people retune and refine their algorithms on new population data, they see improvement in performance. So do I think the AI bubble is going to burst soon? Yes, I think it is bursting at the moment. I've not seen many new startups, especially in the radiology space, recently. Do I think is it going to burst just because of that breakage? No. I think there's, like I said, with retraining and fine tuning, I think once you find the right fit, then when they work fantastically well. So, so that's down to that part. What are the regulator thoughts about the same? The regulators don't care if the bubble's going to burst or not. Their job is to make sure whatever is produced is safe.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Harvey, thank you so very much. This was a wonderful talk and a question and answer session, and we're thrilled to have had you for our lecture series, and we wish you a good evening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.